the creative confidence comes from dismissing this myth that some people are creative and some people aren't, and realizing that you have that same power within you to be creative, to engage in this kind of process.
Keith Sawyer, welcome to Design Better.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
You've got a new book out called Learning to See, which is super interesting. You spent like over a decade talking to hundreds of college professors and students at art and design schools, trying to understand how people teach other people to see things. What was it that brought you to this topic and led to this book?
I started talking to art and design professors in 2010, and I thought I'd be done in 6 months, but I was so fascinated by these compelling and articulate stories that I kept seeking out new artists and designers, and I wanted to see, how universal is this way of thinking and seeing. So in 2010, I was at the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD. I was there on a sabbatical leave, and I had never been to an art and design school. I'm not an artist myself. I don't have a BFA or an MFA. So I came in as a creativity researcher. My own research focused on performance creativity, improvisational comedy, and jazz. I didn't know anything about art and design. So I thought, let me go see, let me go to an art and a design school, and I'll ask them how they teach people how to be creative. And so that'll be, my contribution to creativity research. So it all started in 2010. And then, I just kept going. I loved having these conversations. I kept learning new stuff. And then, 10 years later, I thought it's time to write this book.
You spent your recent time on the book and looks like in academia, but I wanted to rewind a bit to your very early career because it's super interesting. Looks like your first job, and I'm basing this off sleuthing we did on LinkedIn, so there might be inaccuracies, but you worked as a video game designer and then at somewhere called Keenan Systems and did some early work on artificial intelligence. And the video game design is interesting for us. We just had on a few months ago Jordan Mechner, who's the creator of Karateka and Prince of Persia, so some early video games and the computer games in the 1980s and early 1990s. And I was kind of a computer game nerd as a kid. So talk to us a little bit about that. What got you started in that career? How did that kind of lead as a stepping stone to the other work you've done?
My undergraduate degree was in computer science. I went to MIT, and I didn't know anything about creativity research, but I've been a jazz pianist ever since high school, and I played in the jazz band at MIT. And I was graduating, I was interviewing for, and that was 1982. So computer science graduates, there wasn't entrepreneurship and there wasn't, the PC or the internet. So a lot of the computer science graduates would get hired in the military industrial complex. And I interviewed with AT&T and with Hewlett Packard. I was on an airplane flying to an interview in San Francisco, and I saw another guy with an MIT ring on. They're pretty distinctive college rings. And I just went up and started talking to him. And turned out, he said, I've started a video game design company, and we're flying out to California to meet with Atari. And then he said, oh, you're a jazz pianist. You probably know something about creativity. We're trying to hire people who are creative, who also can code. In 1982, not a lot of people knew how to code, and most of them were, not at least stereotypically creative. So they said, when you're back in Cambridge, come over and interview with us. I was like, no one had heard of entrepreneurship. No one I knew was going to a 4-person company. So it was kind of a leap at that time to say, I'm turning away from Hewlett Packard and I'm taking a real leap on this tiny company, but video game design sounds super cool.
That's cool. And also early on, when you're working on your PhD in Chicago, you did your PhD with a legend, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which is a very difficult name to write and say.
That's right. You got it right, yeah.
Most people will know his work on flow and flow state creativity and kind of getting lost in a flow state. He's been very influential in Silicon Valley. I'm curious, what was it like working with him?
Oh, yeah, that was just a phenomenal opportunity because you mentioned I designed video games for 2 years, and then I actually did artificial intelligence management consulting. in the 1980s. And basically I burned out in the late 1980s. I said, I want to go back to graduate school. I want to dive deeper. I really want to find out what goes on when people are being creative. So I went to the University of Chicago, and that's where Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a longtime professor. And I started in 1990, and that was the same year he came out with this blockbuster book called Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. Millions of copies. He was traveling around the world. He went to Davos, Aspen. So it was a heady time, and I just happened to be there working with him on his next project, which was a study of exceptional creators later in life, over 50, at least over 50. So I did a bunch of these interviews with some of these exceptional creators. And that was his second book that came out in 1996. And it's simply called Creativity. So I had this opportunity to work very closely with him. A very inspirational individual, very soft-spoken. Honestly, I don't think he was, a great TEDx speaker. There weren't TEDx back then. So he wasn't the dynamic speaker on stage, but he was this very calm, centered, spiritual individual.
I mean, you've been studying creativity and the way the mind works for some time now, and presumably learned a ton from working with Csikszentmihalyi. Are there some common themes that have emerged over these decades of your research about the creative process?
Absolutely. And I think it all goes back to improvisation. And I don't know if I'm just seeing improvisation everywhere because I'm a jazz musician, but at the beginning of my career, I'm studying. That's what I found the most fascinating is when people are acting before they know what they're doing. And then the creativity emerges from engaging in the process. The creativity doesn't come at the beginning. You don't start by having a brilliant insight. You just dive into the process. And then as you're engaging in the process, the ideas emerge. And that was particularly compelling to me. So my whole career, the key words are improvisation and emergence. Then when I went to study artists and designers, I thought, maybe kind of like this lone genius insight sort of myth that you have a brilliant idea for your painting and then you just go in the studio and you throw it out on the canvas. But that's not what professional painters and designers were telling me. What they were telling me, just to like an improvisational theater performance, they said we start doing the work before we know what we're doing. And we go through this iterative wandering process of working, and then the ideas emerge from the work. So I mentioned painters, but designers told me the same thing. Graphic designers, advertising, architects. This was shared across the visual arts, the nature of the creative process being wandering and iterative and essentially improvisational. So yeah, I would say that's the core of the creative process. It's this iterative nature where you have dead ends, you have restarts, you have a kind of wandering, exploratory path. And you could think of it on a group level, individuals improvising together, or you could think of it as a designer in the studio going through an essentially improvisational process.
Design Better is supported by Miro. I've been in more meetings than I can count where I walked away feeling like we didn't solve the problem that we needed to. And guess what that means? More meetings. There should be a better way for people to collaborate and work through ideas together. Turns out there is. Miro's Innovation Workspace is an intelligent platform that brings people into a shared space to do their best work. I've used Miro to run workshops and design sprints with product designers around the world. And I've watched design and marketing teams work together to turn rough ideas into concrete plans in short meetings. Miro AI can turn unstructured data like sticky notes or screenshots into usable diagrams, product briefs, data tables, and prototypes in minutes. It just accelerates everything. And you can also generate roadmaps and diagrams, tables, content, and more with Miro AI, dropping it all into a collaborative canvas. People who are afraid to draw feel comfortable in Miro because they can write notes, they can give feedback, and communicate their ideas with the easy-to-use tools built in. Help your teams get great work done with Miro. Check out Miro.com to find out how. That's Miro.com, Miro.com.
When you were doing the work on creators who kind of hit their creative stride later in life. And it's an interesting coincidence, but we just interviewed a musician named Fitz from Fitz and the Tantrums, who kind of broke out as a pop star in his mid-40s, which is pretty unusual. But were there any common traits that you found there where was it either just that it was kind of a timing thing, or something that allowed them kind of later in life, in their maybe 40s or 50s, to access that creative thinking?
The reason why Mike Csikszentmihalyi chose to go down this path is because even then, back in, the 1980s, a lot of people would associate creativity with youth and, the stereotypical painter, Pablo Picasso, or, software company founders. A lot of these people are young when they come up with their ideas. So Csikszentmihalyi was interested in, how do you sustain creativity over a lifetime? A lot of people can have one brilliant hit or one brilliant insight, but what is it going to take to sustain that creativity year after year and decade after decade? The interviews I had were with artists and designers who had at least 20 years of experience. So most of them were in their 40s or their 50s, and they would say a lot of the same things to me about what we're trying to teach our students in BFA and MFA programs. We're trying to teach them a deliberate process. We're trying to teach them mindsets and ways of living that are going to sustain them through a career as a creative. We don't want you to just have one brilliant insight. We don't want you to have, one vision and then spend the next 40 years doing that. So that's what we saw when we interviewed people in their 50s. These were people that sustained their creativity. And a lot of the stories they told were about having multiple ideas, multiple projects. Some of them worked in multiple disciplines. So they kept doing new things. They kept changing. They kept applying their mindsets and their practices to new projects and new questions. They didn't just keep doing the same thing over and over again for 50 years. So I'd say that's a message for any creative, try to get out there and change it up. Don't just do the same thing over and over again. A lot of these designers told me, that just won't sustain you. It's going to be a boring life.
Mm. Yeah, we see that with jazz musicians working with different collaborators, people like Herbie Hancock, who's like 82, still touring,
Absolutely.
Still working with new people. He's connected with different instruments and different styles. Miles Davis famously just sort of hit the reset button over and over again to try new things. And in your book, you talk about seeing as a means of thinking. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned about that.
It's a little bit mysterious, isn't it? Even if you're 18 years old and you're starting art school, you can sit in front of a human model and you can sketch the model and you can do a pretty good job. So what is it that they're teaching? I discovered this language of we're teaching them how to see. When I interviewed these artists and designers, I would say, how are you teaching students how to create? And everyone was quite uncomfortable with that question. A lot of them would say, we're not teaching students how to create. Or they'll say something like, the students are already creative. We're teaching them how to realize the potential they have as creatives. But many of them, when I said, how do you teach them how to be creative? They would say, well, we're not doing that, but we are teaching them how to see. And I said, wow, okay. So that's why I ended up calling my book Learning to See. And it's hard to describe. When we talk about learning to see, you're talking about learning to see yourself. The hardest thing to teach a student is how to see their own work, to see something that they've just generated. And what the professors tell me is these 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, they don't realize what they put on the canvas, or if they're a graphic designer, they don't realize what it is that they've generated. A lot of times they'll think they've done a certain thing. So they have, this kind of linear model of the creative process where I'm going to have an idea and I'm going to execute it. So they'll start with their idea and they'll execute it. They'll think that what they put on the canvas is their original idea, but in a lot of cases, it's not. They can't see what they've done themselves. So, right, that's kind of powerful. How do you teach someone that what you put on the canvas isn't what you say you're doing? right? You can't just tell them, hey, you're wrong. Let me tell you what you've done. You have to lead someone through that. So I think that's the hardest thing about learning to see is learning to see yourself, learning to see your own work.
I have some theories about this that, you hear of people like Bob Dylan talking about writing songs. And, reporters, interviewers will ask him, how did you write The Times They Are Changing or, whatever major song that he's written? And he's like, I don't know. It just came through me. And I feel like great works, when a creative thinker is at their height, they don't see themselves. They're closer to what you described earlier. You described, jazz improvisation where you're making a thing and it's not, is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? It's a thing. And then you're reacting to the thing and it quiets that default mode network where, we've got this ego and who we are and all of these constraints and expectations are, live there. And when we quiet those things and we are making things a bit more objectively and participating with it, that we can make better, more creative work. Is that, I don't know, that's a theory. You've got the research. Does that line up at all?
To me, I think of it as, and I think a lot of creatives would say this, is that it's a dialogue. You aren't the person who's creating. Absolutely. And if you think of yourself as the only creative agent in the room, then you're going to try to impose your conscious wish or your vision on the work. But what all these artists and designers tell me is that it's important to get something out in the world, something that's material in many cases. And then you have to look and see what it is that you've done, because it's almost always something different than what you thought. So then you engage in a dialogue with the work, and the dialogue is continuing and ongoing. I call it the dialogue of creativity. So then you are, in a sense, moving the creativity out of yourself into the process. And painters will, and graphic designers, they'll tell me that the work has its own needs. The work has its wishes. The work has inconsistencies or conflicts going on within it. And your job is to see what the work's needs are and then respond to that. So I don't know if that's the same thing as, the inspiration, but I think it has the same characteristic of, stop thinking about you imposing your will on what's happening.
I think this idea of seeing yourself is really interesting, especially in our current generative AI era, where it feels to, a lot of us like there's a potential for AI to take on a lot of the creative tasks that we actually enjoy. But at the same time, its output is often very generic. And by the nature of how it's created, it's the sort of statistical average of everything that humans have done creatively, at least that's accessible via the internet and a few other channels. But I think, and this is held true for the entire time that creative people existed, since we're putting our handprints on a cave wall. But what we bring to creativity is often ourselves and our perspective and our history. And how do you think about people, seeing themselves and accessing that, while at the same time understanding that, as we were touching on earlier, we're often really kind of channeling creativity in a way that's, this drawing from centuries of other creative things that other people have done?
It's a great question. And I think about it in two different ways. And one way is how you use Gen AI. So I use it all the time. I have $20 a month for ChatGPT, and it generates some, pretty impressive output. And so one issue is, are we going to be putting graphic designers out of work because instead of hiring someone to do a logo, you're going to spend 30 minutes with ChatGPT? Yeah, absolutely. So that's one conversation to have. But as a creativity researcher, I'm actually not impressed with Gen AI. And the reason is because Gen AI does not create the same way people create. I'm a cognitive psychologist. My interest is what goes on when people are creating. Gen AI doesn't have anything to teach me about what people are creating, because I've been talking about this iterative process. I've been talking about a dialogue with materials. I've been talking about being surprised by yourself, by something that you've generated, putting the creative vision outside of yourself into the process. Absolutely. But you don't have to know very much about Gen AI to know that's not at all how it creates. So one conversation then is about the outputs of Gen AI, but the other conversation is about the process. And the process, yeah, it's nothing like what people do. That doesn't mean it doesn't generate great outputs, but if we want to help people be more creative, which is one of my goals, how can we use this understanding of creativity to help people be more creative, to have more fulfilling lives, to be more likely to get into this flow state of peak experience when they're creating? You're not going to emulate ChatGPT. To do that, you're going to try to learn how to engage in this process and these mindsets and these practices. So like I said, two different types of conversations. But as a creativity researcher, at least at the moment, Gen AI doesn't have anything to teach me.
Design Better is supported by Sawyer. I love to travel, but what I don't like is the hassle of figuring out my cell phone situation when I'm abroad. In the past, I've gone to a kiosk at my destination airport to get a SIM, but who wants to wait in a line after an international flight? Plus, those things always seem a little sketch to me. How much is this going to cost me? Sawyer makes all this super easy. You can download their app on your phone, and you can buy an eSIM before you fly, so you're connected the minute that you land. And if you're traveling between countries, you only need one eSIM. You can get a global or a regional plan and travel with the same eSIM plan. You'll save money significantly with an eSIM over your carrier's roaming plans, which gets super pricey quickly. Activate Sawyer's security features and browse more confidently. You can change your virtual location, block ads, and stay safer with web protection. All Sawyer eSIM plans are compatible for iOS and Android devices. If you travel internationally, this is what you'll need to stay connected without spending a fortune. Download the Sawyer app in your app store. Search for Sawyer, S-A-I-L-Y. Use code DESIGNBETTER at checkout, and you'll save 15% off your first purchase. Or go to Sawyer.com/designbetter. That's SAILY.com/designbetter.
What can people do who are working in creative fields to cultivate that skill of seeing, the power of observation?
There's a lot you can do, and everyone can get better at it. So one thing I've already hinted at, which is the importance of engaging in a dialogue with your own work. And to do that, you do have to be able to see your own work clearly. So you kind of have to get a distance. So maybe that's the first lesson, is to put a distance between yourself and what you've generated. See if you can perceive it as something separate, its own agent, its own being. And only then can you engage in that dialogue.
And the distance, when you describe distance, what are some specific methods that come to mind?
That's one of the powers of art school, I believe, is that you're in a studio class with other people. So other students are telling you what they're seeing. So yeah, I would recommend doing this with other people. Get other people to comment on your work. And in a safe space where someone could be honest with you. And then, of course, you have to try not to get defensive and take what's being said to move you forward.
Yeah, something you said earlier, I think maybe aligns, that you described creative thinkers as creating many things and having multiple avenues simultaneously. What's great about that is it's sort of, if you hit a roadblock, you can just hang a left or hang a right into a different pathway and try something else and then come back with fresh eyes to a thing. But then you've got multiple things that you've created. And so no one is particularly high stakes. I think of my time, I was studying at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And I was there taking a painting class one summer, and I sort of had a breakthrough painting in my studio. And a professor came in and talked to me about it, and he's like, man, I don't know what you've done, but you've really cracked open some new ideas here. And I got so stuck on that one painting after he told me that, I couldn't make another painting. I just fixated on it, and I became paralyzed, and I couldn't make any other paintings. It's almost debilitating to just have all your eggs in one basket. Oh,
I have a great example of this, multiple pathways underway at the same time. And it's a MFA student I interviewed named Adam Reinhardt. And he was exploring different pathways. He was kind of going through a struggle because he felt like nothing he was working on really was resonating with him. He wasn't compelled. He started out his MFA program thinking, I'm interested in social change. And he was fascinated with the image of the foot because he was thinking of protest marches. He's like, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to protest. I'm going to advocate for social change. But very early on in art school, that just wasn't working out. He was generating these paintings about protest marches, and it wasn't working. So he was exploring. He started painting images of young girls, like 9 and 10 years old, but wearing business suits and business skirts and carrying briefcases. And he was going to tell a message about, work-life balance and about consumerism and capitalism. These 9-year-olds were falling through space wearing women's suits. And so that wasn't working. So Adam had a friend who was a photographer, and the photographer had just gotten a fisheye lens. So Adam saw this fisheye lens photo. It was a portrait of an individual face, and he got fascinated. He got so fascinated, he painted really fast. He painted the same photograph he had just seen of the fisheye face. And he looked at it and he said, that's got some power to it. But he was working on these falling girls. So he just puts the painting in the corner of his studio. And you see this all the time in any artist studio, effective professional artists. They keep stuff around and they're always experimenting. And there's, little crap sitting around that they did 2 years ago or 6 months ago. So Adam's continuing to work. He starts painting falling girls, and it's just not working out. And he keeps being drawn back to this fisheye painting that he did of a fisheye photograph. And he said, I need to explore that further. So he started painting, and he was like, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm going to paint people looking down from the ceiling, and it's going to have that look like a fisheye lens where their head's going to be really big. And he started to have a vision about how this is a commentary on emotions and personal relationships. And he started getting really excited. It's a great example about how you can have an idea like months ago, and it just kind of resonates with you, but you're not really sure why yet. So keep these things around. Maybe you'll never go back to it, but maybe you'll get to a point where the path you're on just isn't resonating with you and you need to try something else. And, if you have these other projects sitting around you, there's always going to be something that you can explore further.
You describe the challenge of the artist is going into the studio with great ambiguity. You may walk in with preconceptions of the work and your intentions for what you're going to do, but then those are stymied. It just doesn't work as you expected. And then you're in a spot that is confusing, open-ended. It's worrisome. It can create a lot of anxiety. I felt this as an artist going into the studio where I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. There are some people who are really great with that creative ambiguity that, well, I just don't know what's going to happen, and so I'm just going to dig in and see what happens. They don't really get that anxiety attack that others have. Some people call it the white canvas effect. Blank canvas page effect. Why is it that some people are more comfortable operating in ambiguity and others are just absolutely shut down by it?
I heard a lot of designers tell me things like a professional designer knows how to operate in a world of ambiguity, or that this is the essence of successful design and the design process, that you can thrive in ambiguity as opposed to it being debilitating. Again, it's a good reason to go to design school because these studio classes are very much focused on I would call it a project-based model. The instructors give the students very highly structured problems or prompts or parameters. Sometimes, you'll have a 3-week project and the instructor will give you the instructions for the 3-week project will be like a page single spaced with these bullet points. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. So a very high degree of constraint. And that was surprising to me because I thought, stereotypical view of creativity, just do whatever you want to do. But the professors told me, yeah, like you said, that's debilitating. These students don't yet know how to work in a world of ambiguity. And it's our job as their instructors to help them thrive in ambiguity.
I wonder if in the same way that constraints can be helpful, friction can be helpful. And I wonder a little bit too about how AI is going to affect this. So if you think about visual art, and if I think about my kids, they're still, my daughter just entered high school and my son's in elementary school, and they're still doing a lot of hands-on drawing, painting, things like that. On the writing side of things, I think things are changing even more rapidly, where obviously we have access to these GPT tools that will generate an entire essay or even an entire book for you. And, Aaron and I have spent a lot of our careers writing, and I think we've gone through that process many times of how writing affects and structures our thinking. But if you don't have that friction of, okay, I need to come up with something, or I need to work through a few drafts of this before I can come to a real complete thought or something that's worth sharing. Yeah, I'm just wondering how that's going to affect the creative process and how friction plays into it currently.
I'm going through that now. I'm working on a new book where I'm trying to develop messages, inspirational messages for everyone that I can take from what these artists and designers do. And I actually have been using ChatGPT quite a bit, but as a dialogue partner. So I'll get to a point in the text where I'll say, I'm not really sure what to do with this next paragraph. And I'll say, hey, here's a paragraph I just wrote, and I want the next paragraph to continue in this manner. And why don't you give me a suggestion? So I've started engaging with Gen AI as a dialogue. So I don't think it works if you say, write 2,000 words and I'll have chapter 1. But when you start to engage in this dialogue, and I'm having that experience myself, it's a very different process.
Design Better is supported by Masterclass. My wife gives me a hard time because I fall into rabbit holes often. I'm curious about the world, and I'm in a perpetual pursuit of knowledge. What can I say? I could spend hours doom scrolling or getting lost in Instagram, but I know that won't make me a better person. Instead, what I do is I pop open Masterclass on my phone and I dive into an enriching topic, like how to eat better, which is taught by Michael Pollan. He's one of my favorite authors. And Nobel laureate Paul Krugman has a masterclass on economics that I can jump into. Or I can learn about writing from Margaret Atwood, graphic design from David Carson, photography from Annie Leibovitz, or documentary filmmaking from Ken Burns. Now, that's a great use of my time and attention. And I think it's a great use of your attention, too. Whether you want to learn to write better, improve your public speaking, enhance your creativity, or become a better cook, hey, Masterclass has in-depth expertise that you can tap into anytime and any place. You can access Masterclass on your phone, your computer, your tablet, smart TV, or even in audio mode. You can listen to these classes. And right now, Design Better listeners get an additional 15% off an annual membership at masterclass.com/designbetter. That's 15% off at masterclass.com/designbetter.
I use AI in writing a lot like the way that you described the creative process as sort of thinking. There's this friction to getting started. I think probably a lot of people have this, but I need to write something. I have a rough idea for a piece that I want to write, but I don't really know the outline, the structure, and getting started, just getting that early momentum is kind of painful. And that is not the final output. That is just a thing. It's like, aha, okay, I've got something to work with, which is not unlike, people have been working for many years. So in the 60s, the Fluxists, the way they would chop up pieces of newspaper or magazine and pull random words and start to create art from that. Or, the Dadaists would play this party game, Exquisite Corpse, where someone draws a little piece, like they draw the legs and then you draw the torso and then the next person draws the head. So we've always had these sorts of tools for kickstarting creativity. Have you seen any novel ways that people are using AI to kickstart creativity, or even other methods that don't use these modern technologies?
I have a lot of techniques like this in, my more like my practical advice books, like a book I wrote in 2013 called Zigzag, where I've got over 100 techniques for, exercises you can use to practice your creativity. So one of the chapters in my book is how to have lots of ideas and how to have surprising new ideas. In creativity research, going back to the 1950s, we call that divergent thinking, or, having your thought diverge into a lot of different ideas. And you contrast that with convergent thinking, where you're trying to converge on the one right idea. So that's a big part of creativity research for a long time. But there's some new research studies. So they give undergraduates, their research subjects, and they say, use Gen AI and come up with a solution to this problem. And they'll present a problem. Or they'll say, come up with 10 ideas to help solve this problem. So they'll give, 200 students, they'll let them use Gen AI for this. And they take 200 other students and they say, no, you can't use Gen AI. So what the findings are over and over again is the 200 people who use Gen AI, all of their ideas converge in the sense that they explore a more narrow space than the 200 people that didn't use Gen AI. If you put together everything they came up with, their ideas are more distant from each other. They explore a broader conceptual space. So it seems like collectively, maybe not one person, but collectively 200 people or 1,000 people, you're going to have a more narrow range of ideas are going to come out of that if you're using Gen AI. And that's a problem because we know that a lot of the most creative ideas come out of what we call distant combinations or remote combinations. So yeah, if everybody always uses Gen AI, that's going to reduce the creative potential collectively of society. So hopefully there will be some people who keep working without Gen AI so they can help get us a broader exploration of the potential creative space.
Keith, I'm curious, we've all heard sentences, statements like, I'm not creative. Oh, I can't do that. I don't know how to draw. What do you say to people when you hear them say that?
Oh, it's sad for me to hear that. And it's false. Everyone is creative and everyone has that same potential for creativity. So yeah, I think that's a debilitating myth, to use a big word. And part of it comes from the myth that creativity comes from having a big and brilliant idea, or to have a vision that somehow is different and unique from everyone else. So that myth of the big idea or the big insight kind of feeds into the myth that some people are creative and some people aren't, because the way you get to be creative is you engage in a process and you use a set of mindsets and practices, then ideas emerge from that process. And in my research, I would say those mindsets and practices absolutely can be taught and can be learned. Anyone can learn how to engage in the process of creativity and to see when those good ideas emerge at the end. So the good news is anyone can do it, but it does take practice and it takes some experience working through these exercises. I guess the bad news is that it's hard work. There really aren't shortcuts. The inside view of creativity is kind of like an easy shortcut, right? Hey, so-and-so had a really brilliant insight, so creativity is easy for them. And I'm not having a brilliant insight, so I'm not creative. So that's just a misconception about how creativity works. They don't start with an idea. They engage in the process and the ideas emerge from engaging in the process. So when they talk about the creative process, some of them will tell me things like, it's kind of boring. It's just hard work. I'm just doing the work. Nothing too dramatic. But that's not going to make a very good movie about a painter.
My colleague and my former advisor, David Kelly at the D School, wrote a book called Creative Confidence with his brother that dives really deep into this and talks about how our education system in a lot of ways is broken because it's in the early years, it's set up to sort of separate the creative from non-creative kids when in reality, like you said, everybody has a creative potential. But since you've been studying sort of later education, I'm wondering if there's any ways in which you see our current system. Are there any ways in which it's maybe a little broken or it could be improved as far as preparing these students as they enter the world to have a creative career?
There's a body of research on what's sometimes called self-beliefs or creative self-beliefs, and it's closely related to Kelly's idea of creative confidence, that if you have creative self-beliefs, if you reflect on yourself as a creative individual, you actually will be more creative. It's almost like the power of manifestation, but it's, not a spiritual thing. It's just a psychological finding. Thinking of yourself as creative will make you more creative. So yeah, that's what I hear when I hear creative confidence. The creative confidence comes from dismissing this myth that some people are creative and some people aren't, and realizing that you have that same power within you to be creative, to engage in this kind of process. And I keep saying engage in the process, not about having ideas. It's not about generating something that just looks super cool, but creative confidence comes from knowing how to engage in that process and having the experience of something good emerging from the process. But the effective creativity is going to come from that space of ambiguity where ideas emerge. So I think we could do that in our schools, in our educational institutions, to help students get through that ambiguity and learn to trust the process. But yeah, I think that's an important task for the teacher, and it's not always easy to do.
Yeah. Your book, Learning to See, just came out in April, and already you're working on another book. I wonder if you could give us a little sneak peek of what you're researching and writing about now.
Absolutely. So, I started working on the new book, like 8 months ago, and I'm still working on it. But at the core of my new book is that when I talk to these artists and designers about what they're trying to do for their students, they're trying to teach their students how to see in a new way and how to think about themselves in a new way. What I see is a story about personal transformation, and not just a story about creativity, but a story about understanding yourself. So to me, it seems like that's a powerful message for everyone about how to live your life. It's not even just for artists and designers. There's a message in there somewhere. So I'm like Adam Reinhart. I'm like, that's got some power to it. That idea that the process that people go through to learn how to understand themselves better, to generate better art and design. I think those same mindsets and practices have the potential to give you a more fulfilling life, to help you experience that flow state more often. So that's what I'm trying to do with the new book. I'm calling it The Creative Way, which is, just a working title. I think I need a catchier title, but somehow that's what I'm going for, is how can I generalize the power of learning to see for everyone, to help everyone have a more fulfilling life.
Keith, where can people learn more about you and your book, Learning to See, which is out from MIT Press? Where can people learn more about what you're doing?
Visit my website, keithsawyer.com, and that's where you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter. I hope you'll consider listening to my own podcast, which is called The Science of Creativity. And you'll hear everything that I think on a weekly and a biweekly basis about creativity, how creativity works, what's going on in our culture and our society at my website, keithsawyer.com.
Fantastic. We will make sure to include all of those links in the show notes too. Keith Sawyer, thanks so much for joining us on Design Better.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.